Okay, good morning. It's great to be here amongst many friends and a few rather demanding members of the audience as well, so God knows where it's going to go. And welcome to the second best out-of-home convention in the world. I'll explain that later, okay? Right, let's have a slide. Good. Okay, first I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, which will give you some context. Then I'm going to talk about the organization I represent and why I'm here and why you might perhaps be interested in it. And finally, I'm going to touch on a few issues that I see preoccupying and challenging the out-of-home industry globally, albeit with different emphasis in different markets according to their development and their maturity. So let's go. I've been in advertising, mainly the media side of it, for well over 40 years now. I'm not young. I started as a trainee television airtime buyer in the days when the UK's commercial inventory was controlled by a set of regional monopolies, and they effectively rationed airtime out to advertisers. So what we called buying was really persuading sellers to give us a preferential deal, us and our clients. And I'm going to come back to that thing about us and our clients later as well. I seemed to be okay at that, and I progressed until I found myself co-owning and running a full-service agency with some very talented partners. That was in the 1980s, which was a really good time to be doing that, and a really good time to be doing it in London, which is one of the greatest cities in the world, you probably know that, and alongside New York, an epicenter for creative advertising. So I'm going to return to that theme as well. I had a short spell as a media-centric management consultant, which is the time that I earned the most money in my career. I made a lot of money doing it, but I didn't find it at all fulfilling. And then I was pleased to be headhunted to be the UK advertisers' representative and lobbyist on media issues, a job that I ended up doing for about 20 years and making my own. So I was kind of like the ANA in the US. That involved working with most of the biggest advertisers at local and increasingly global level. So bringing us right up to date, for the past 2 years, I've struck out on my own and I've gone plural, as gentlemen of a certain age tend to do. And I'm a participant investor in 2 businesses. One is called Blackwood 7, which is an artificial intelligence-powered communications planning platform, which is successful in its native Denmark, Scandinavia, Germany, and here in the US, and is now developing in the UK. And its pitch is much greater granularity of effect in real time and accurate prediction of return on marketing investment, prediction of marketing ROI, which is the holy grail to advertisers. It's a killer application, but maybe I should leave it until afterwards to regale you with delights of Bayesian statistics and, this is a real mouthful, Hamiltonian and Monte Carlo Mondchain statistical analysis techniques. They are all real. You can look them up on Wikipedia. That's not bullshit. Then there's Fenestra, which is another recent startup which offers advertisers a new and completely transparent media trading platform based on blockchain technology, as the Latin name for Windows suggests. I also undertake some confidential project work for a number of big advertiser and media owner clients, and I'm a recognized industry commentator in the media. As part of this, I write regularly for 2 respected UK industry titles. My work for Marketing Week tends to be quite instructional, whereas for Mediatel, my writing is rather more provocative, making me a bit like the ad contrarian in the US, my mentor and friend Bob Hoffman. If you haven't read Bob Hoffman, have you read The Ad Contrarian? You know who he is? Highly recommended, if only to make you think. You may have to agree with him, but highly recommended. But he really lifts the lid off stuff. Anyway, my credentials nearly over. The reason that I'm here in front of you today, I'm also executive director of FEPE, which is the global body for the out-of-home industry. And I was privileged to be invited to take over this role just over a year ago from my good old friend and industry stalwart John Ellery, who many of you will know as one of the people who pretty much built the international out-of-home industry into what it is today. So let me tell you about FEPE. FEPE launched in 1959, when I was the tender age of 4, as La Fédération de la Publicité Extérieure, by Jacques Dauphin, who was one of the founding fathers of a vibrant French out-of-home industry. He saw the similarities around the world and has a vision of the enhanced influence that joining hands could yield. A not-for-profit membership body, from modest beginnings, FEPE has grown and grown, in no small part due to my predecessor John Ellery's efforts, and also FEPE General Secretary Mark Fliss, who's here. It now embodies members from over 50 countries in all continents, apart from Antarctica, where I don't think there's out of home yet, and nor are we off-world yet. Many major national associations, like your OAAA, are also affiliates, and Roseanne Karen from the Canadian Association is here today. Our activities fall into 4 main areas, and I won't dwell on this. It's a pretty quick visit slide, but community, connecting, curating, and celebrating. FEPE is overseen by a president, elected from a board of very senior out-of-home media owner representatives, one of whom is here today, Jeremy. Thank you for coming. And the president is currently Tom Goddard of Ocean Outdoor, which has just reversed itself out of private equity ownership into a public listing. So it's kind of turned into a buyer. We also keep it pretty lean. Most of the executive team that I lead work part-time, so we only have the equivalent of about 2.5 full-time employees. But we punch above our weight. We are the network for out-of-home professionals around the globe. We channel best practice and other useful advice between members, which sometimes helps them in their discussions with their governments, legislators, regulators. We represent the industry at the ad content and self-regulatory bodies, IACA and ICAS. IACA is the European one, ICAS is the global one. Again, if you have a US perspective, this might not have very much meaning, but it has tremendous amount of meaning when it comes to ad content regulation in many other countries. We have a growing database of information about the medium in many countries, which can be used in marketing and sometimes even in mergers and acquisitions. Our weekly newsletter gathers information from around the world and has become the reference update for the industry. Though tightening European privacy regulations now require us to reconfirm everybody's subscriptions, and unlike Facebook, we can't simply offshore somewhere with less stringent rules. Another thing I might touch on again before I start. So far, I'm still in sync with my sides, which is always good. The high point in our year is our annual Congress event, which is held in early June and in a different city each time, over 3 days. Hence my cheeky opening quip about this being the second best out-of-home event in the world. Some 400 delegates from over 40 countries gather to network and discuss the key issues of the day. Media owners, agencies, out-of-home specialists, audience research bodies, and equipment and tech suppliers. Someone has even, rather amusingly, called it the Davos of out-of-home, which is very flattering. This year's event is being held in gorgeous Sorrento on Italy's Amalfi Coast, which is spectacular at this time of year. And the speakers are drawn from senior media owners, specialists, agencies, and advertisers, and a few people from slightly beyond the industry. So we have a futurist speaking to us this year about some slightly further ahead developments. And the good news is it isn't too late to book your place. Now, I know a lot of you are booked already, so I'm probably talking to the wall here, but seats and spaces are still available. If you're interested, Mark and I are the people to talk to. Okay, so that's done me and that's done FEPE. Let me move on to a few issues that are exercising people in our industry. I'm mindful that the US industry is rather different insofar as you have a thriving regional and local advertising ecosystem, with national buys accounting for a relatively small share of total out-of-home compared to most other markets. So some of my comments may have less relevance to some of you. But I've picked 4 things to highlight. First, the march from, still in time, from classic static billboards to digital panels. Most everybody is investing in digital panel. CapEx is high, but the returns are good. In the UK, about 50% of out-of-home revenue now comes from digital panels, even though they represent slightly less than 20% of the whole network. So revenue and margin are high, but advertisers seeking good old-fashioned reach have to supplement their activity with classic paper and panel billboards. Indeed, there's a reawakening amongst brand advertisers of the importance of scale reach and the attendant fame that it affords their brands. And this plays really well into the hands of broadcast TV and especially out of home, which can deliver reach cost effectively. Yet, as the industry has invested heavily in expensive digital displays, it's tended to underinvest in its classic stock, some of which is now looking tired. And sellers, specialist buyers and advertisers alike are tending to undervalue these displays. The biggest advertiser in the UK, the leading subscription broadcaster Sky, and they are the biggest advertiser by a margin of 2, they told last year's FEPE Congress that they were concerned about this underpricing and underinvestment. Now, some in the room felt they spoke with forked tongue, but it's not often that you hear a client tell you that you're selling yourself too cheap. And it's the kind of thing I would listen to. There's a watch out here. It's not economically viable to convert every billboard to digital, so classic panels are going to have a role going forward for some time, but they will need better ongoing investment in maintenance and marketing in order to continue to drive revenue in a competitive market. Second on my list, some of you who know me and have had a few drinks with me in bars might know that I have strong views about this. Automation. Automation makes sense. It should make transacting with clients and agencies simpler, quicker, and more efficient. Agencies are having to automate in response to continued client pressure on margins and more recent calls for restoration of transparency. But the out-of-home industry is still quite fragmented, and progress is therefore dogged by the many different legacy, inventory management, and accounting systems. And this means that it can't or won't offer buyers any kind of harmonized trading system. Now, these comments might already be a few minutes out of date, but they were written a few days ago. In other words, one of the most obvious benefits of automation is not yet being widely realized. And I realize this might be a particular problem here because your industry is actually more complex and fragmented. Things will surely improve as the industry consolidates, as it's starting to do. In Europe, the talk is about a shakedown to 4 players, 2 large and 2 significant challenger brands. But whilst on automation, I want to raise a particular bête noire of mine, which has brought me into conflict with some, and that's the subset of automation that is called programmatic. And like with any other conference, you couldn't move at this conference without talking about programmatic. It's on everybody's lips. Many in this industry believe that they must claim to offer customers a programmatic solution, lest they simply forfeit their entire revenue base to the online players. I challenge this on several fronts. First, I've already mentioned that advertisers are remembering the need for fame as part of the construct that enables a healthy brand to charge a premium price and become sustainable. Jeremy, you used to run, famous coffee brands a long time ago, and actually, if you zap back in time, the tools have changed, but the job, the objectives, very, very similar. Pressure on margins, sure, but very similar. Second, the tide of public and legislative opinion has turned against the online players, something I'll return to in my closing remarks. But third and most important, out-of-home doesn't address a targetable audience of individual impressions, which is the programmatic promise. Rather, out-of-home's strengths is that it reaches crowds, or at least in the words of my friend from Gideon Adey of Kinetic, small herds. One slide behind. There you go. Now, this wouldn't be so much of a problem if the advertisers themselves had not invested significantly in programmatic, sometimes bringing it in-house. The consequence of this is that they've had to get to understand programmatic much better than they've ever had to get to understand all the other legacy media channels. And now that they understand it, they can see through anybody, any medium claiming to be programmatic when it's not. Sales credibility is lost in a stroke, and in my opinion, that's my opinion backed up by conversations with many advertisers, that they actually go, stop pretending that you're something to get my money when you're not. Sell to your strength rather than somebody else's strength is the message I get. So it's quite a solemn message, actually. Third, I want to come to data, the new altar at which we must all kneel. There's no doubt that informed decisions are better. But the sheer quantity of data now being generated and captured far exceeds anybody's ability to actually interpret it. And it's that interpretation into insight, not data itself, that's important. Data is a tool, not an outcome. The out-of-home industry has rightly invested significantly in the space. Audience research like Geopath here and Root in the UK have made huge leaps forward using tech to deliver better and more granular information, and they'll continue. But again, it will be dangerous to try and mimic the online players' ability to capture and manipulate data simply because they've been eating our lunch. I would suggest that we neither can nor should. The online players have been rumbled on their use of data, and public opinion over data is very much turning against them. And, I don't need to dredge up all the different stuff. Most recently, the Cambridge Analytics scandal that broke in the UK, but has pulled Facebook's share price down. It's significant. And across Europe, May 23rd, we'll see the implementation of the snappily named General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which you'll have heard about while you've been here. And that very directly puts power and control back in the hands of the individual. And if you operate in Europe, you'll need to abide by these rules, as the penalties for infringement are really punitive. They can be 4% of turnover, so if you're a big company, that's a big sting. Meanwhile, other uses of data play into our hands. For example, digital return paths enable a renaissance in something as prosaic as proof of appearance, just at a time when that very proof of appearance is coming into question again in the online channel, which is stealing our lunch. Artificial intelligence is already affecting each and every one of us in ways we seldom imagine. And in my work with Blackwood 7, I've seen how it can and does revolutionize media planning too. I don't have time to explain blockchain tech here, too, such as that offered by my partners at Finestra, but again, it can restore transparency and accountability that the advertisers are crying out for, and thought they were getting, but weren't. Early in my comments, I made a reference to buying media for nominated clients and brands. As you all know, the big media buyers now tend to buy media in bulk and then resell it to their brands, their clients, at differential prices. This has been going on for a long time, and it gathered pace until John Mandel, latterly of Mediacom, blew the whistle at an ANA conference about 3 years ago. This led the ANA to launch an inquiry and publish a manifesto, which I, in my then job in the UK, echoed. Others followed, and some big advertisers, like P&G's Mark Pritchard, called time on non-transparent practice, which is particularly pronounced in the multi-layered online value chain. Blockchain-based trading platforms, which offer end-to-end financial visibility and payment mechanisms, and tiered escrow systems, if you're interested in the detail, are now garnering serious interest from such clients. And it's only a matter of time before one installs one. They're already in beta, and if those beta tests are half successful, then one or two of them will adopt, and it'll be a significant change for the industry. Which takes me to my fourth and final topic, which is the competitive set. All legacy media channels have been losing revenue to the new online channels. To be fair, I should say out-of-home has held on to its revenues better than most. In the UK, it's shown growth ahead of most other offline media. In Australia, it's posted 6.1% growth against a market of 2.8%, and we heard yesterday that it's holding on to its 4% share here when other legacy media channels are losing share. But it's now emerging that the online world has been taking much of this money under what you could call false pretenses, and you'll know the bogeyman, the four horsemen of the digital apocalypse that I'm going to enumerate now. Ads that aren't viewable because they're below the fold, off-screen, and can't be seen without scrolling. Or because they're loading in windows which are obscured by other windows which sit in front. When I started out using computers, processing power and RAM memory was so scant that you had to close unused programs and windows. But this is no longer an issue. How many windows do your kids have open at once? Watch, it's 50, 60, 70. So if you've got 30 browser windows open and ads are loading, only one of those windows is even possibly visible, even if it's not completely visible. Money is still being transacted on the basis of all the stuff that's covered. It transpires that only about 50% of online ads are viewable to an industry standard. The industry standard was set here that it requires only 50% of pixels to be in view for 1 second for static and 2 seconds for video. I have to say I'm quite proud that the UK pretty much rejects the US, the MRC standard. It was good that they got to a standard because it made everyone realize there had to be a standard, but the standard is so low it's so easy to boot. And there are now many clients in the UK who are specifying visibility, viewability rather, into their buys. Some of them are starting at 50, some of them are actually going for 90 or 100. And the industry is actually saying we can't deliver at 100, so that's a whole new argument. But moving on to the other horsemen of the digital apocalypse, ads that aren't even on sites they purported to be when you were buying the space, but instead on fraudulent sites with artificial audiences generated by click farms. 3 national newspapers in the UK have actually gone out and tried to buy their own inventory. The Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Times, probably newspapers that you know here. They've all bought their own inventory, and they've found variously that between 70 and 30% of the inventory they bought wasn't theirs. Now, since they make the inventory, I think you can safely say that they are expert in what constitutes their own inventory. So that's not a figure that you could kind of negotiate and say, oh, well, you know, it's a bit of wiggle room. No, if you buy your own shit and you only get 30 or 70% of it back, there's a big problem. There's a big waste going on. So, the next horseman, brand safety. Ads for reputable brands, perhaps with family values, that are often appearing next to some really unsavory and unsafe ad environments. Jihad, grossly indecent content, incitements to violence and crime. It's happened. Every mainstream advertiser, certainly in the UK and probably in the US, has found themselves adjacent to this stuff. And this is a public relations disaster. One impression that cost 5 pence or 0.5 of a penny can lead to £100,000 worth of public relations crisis damage limitation. It's quite unusual for the offline media to be able to create such damage so cheaply. The online media can do it in spades. And then you even have situations where ads are bought and placed and priced on the basis of inflated audience claims. You probably know this story as well. Facebook, amongst others, was at one point claiming more young adult users in the UK than existed on our own national population census. And by the way, those national population censuses were also validated by the fact that we have a thriving, independent media audience research industry in the UK, all of which continuously revalidate the population estimates. But Facebook was selling more of them than existed. Successfully. Yeah. Okay. The net of all this is that in some cases, less than 10% of an advertiser's money is getting through to manifest in what the advertiser calls working media. That's media that does stuff in front of a real person, maybe like gets them to favorably consider or even buy something, which I think is what advertising is supposed to do. And yes, the advertisers are getting pissed about it. Yet only recently have the online media really turned the temperature up with greatly increased investment and in effectiveness research and return on investment case histories. And thankfully, the fight back is now well and truly underway, and I sincerely hope we'll see more and more of such efforts until a new balance is found, and one which challenges online and much better favours offline, particularly out of home. The OAAA's marketing campaigns that we saw yesterday are central to this kind of push. And finally, we should never stop making the best of one of our greatest assets, to be the ultimate focusing lens for advertising creativity. If a client and an agency can simplify a proposition until it can be communicated through a billboard, it will likely triumph. So, with great relief amongst you, I'm sure, I'm just about to wrap up. To conclude, I hope you found my comments interesting, hopefully entertaining, perhaps even useful. You'll have gathered that I believe the out-of-home medium has some issues to resolve, but it's extremely well placed for a future where more affluent customers, enabled and liberated by technology, will spend more time out of home seeking entertainment and experience. Two of the most sought-after things amongst advertisers are reach and targetability, and out-of-home delivers both very strongly indeed. Thank you.
I'd like to open the floor to any questions.
Oh.
Yes.
Bob, that was great.
Thank you.
When our team looks at advertising campaigns to try and share with people who are interested in learning about out of home, they're always bringing stuff that they find online for campaigns that are set outside of the U.S. Not always, but there's great stuff that's happening internationally. So can you speak to why do you think that is? Do you agree? And are there some things that we're doing here in the U.S. that are better than what's happening internationally and vice versa? From the creativity side.
Okay.
Maybe that has to do with permissions and things like that.
I think the strongest determining factor is actually a matter of national taste. When I come here and I watch the TV, well, actually, you guys sell to each other all the time. You sell, it's in your DNA. Whereas the British are very reluctant. We really hold back. We're quite almost the opposite. And if you contrast some of the kind of advertising you might be alluding to, some of that British advertising is trying its damnedest almost not to sell. And I think Americans find that very, very hard. I think they quite like to look at it, but they find it very hard to commission and pay money for. And I think that's at the root of this. And I think this is, I could have been answering this question in 1955. And I probably wouldn't have said much different, except, of course, that we've all become globalized and much more aware of each other. And the other thing is, I think this market, it's entirely acceptable and legitimate to sell, to move straight into a sales conversation, whereas it's really, really bad form amongst British people. I understand that it's not great form. You know, Canada sits somewhere between the two. Australia sits somewhere between the two. The French, they don't like it much either. So if you like, the advertising is being designed for the national taste, and the national taste is more in your face or less. But nevertheless, I do think that there's something else that's a problem, which is that in the last 10 or 15 years, the clients have had the whip hand over the agencies. There's too many agencies oversupplying. The clients are probably not spending any more money, so they put it out to pitch, and they can get agencies to jump higher and higher. And what this means is, one of the consequences is that the client's hand is much more visible through the advertising. And what that means is that a lot of UK advertising, for example, European advertising, is beginning to resemble some of your poorer advertising. Because the reason that a client should use an agency is because the agency can do things it can't. Classic case of why bark yourself if you've got a dog. So I think that's really, really important. So I think the standard of advertising has dropped because the clients are trying to put more and more stuff and features and stuff into advertising, whereas the advertising that works best actually engages the curiosity. And that's where that really stripped back old British famous stuff works so well. It's a very long answer, but